Hello, my name is Velia Cardin. I'm a neuroscientist and an associate professor at the Deafness, Cognition and Language Research Center at UCL. In my research, I study the deaf brain. This not only contributes evidence to guide and improve health and education for deaf people, but it can also tell us a lot about how the brain actually works. Today, I want to tell you about a research paper called Dissociating Cognitive and Sensory Neural Plasticity in the Human Superior Temporal Cortex. Now, in this paper, we look at similarities and differences between deaf and hearing people in how the brain works, and between deaf people who are signers and those who are oral deaf. So the brain is the organ that we use for making sense of all the information that gets through our senses. And we know that in hearing people, there is a part of the brain that is involved in making sense of sounds. That part of the brain is called auditory cortex. We also know that the auditory cortex in people who are deaf has different functions to the auditory cortex in hearing people. In people who are deaf, the auditory cortex has a role in understanding other sensory information such as vision and touch. That difference in function between deaf and hearing people is what we call cross-modal plasticity. Plasticity basically means change, and modal or modality refers to the sensory information, for example, vision or sounds. So cross-modal plasticity means a difference in function in a part of the brain, in this case the auditory cortex, where for deaf people there is a change in that part of the brain from processing sounds to processing vision and touch. What we didn't know before this research was whether there were differences in brain function depending on the language that you first learned as a child and used throughout your life, for example, sign language or speech. That is, what we wanted to know was whether the role of what we usually call auditory cortex is different between deaf signers and deaf oral. Knowing this was important because, as well as contributing to us understanding more about language, deafness, and the brain, it also clarifies whether knowing a sign language causes other changes or additional changes in brain function. This, unfortunately, without any evidence, has been sometimes claimed as detrimental for future speech learning in deaf children. So we thought it was very important to understand whether this was the case. So to investigate the question, what we did was to use a technique that we call fMRI, and this technique uses an MRI scanner like those scanners found in hospitals, and by using the technique fMRI we can study brain function in humans in a non-invasive manner. And we had three groups of participants: a group of deaf signers, a group of deaf oral people, and a group of hearing people who didn't know any sign language. So while people were in the MRI scanner, we showed them videos of BSL and also pictures that didn't have any sign language content. While people were looking at this, we recorded their brain activity. So what we found was that the function of the auditory cortex in deaf signers and in oral deaf is the same when they look at images without any sign language. It doesn't matter if you are a signer or oral deaf, there's going to be same brain activity in auditory cortex when you look at images without any language. Now, this shows that changes in brain function in the auditory cortex are driven by whether someone can hear or not. They are not driven by whether they know a sign language. We also found that some regions of the auditory cortex are actually involved in sign language processing. This was only observed in signers, of course, because they were the only group that understood sign language. We know from other studies at DICA that these regions of the brain in the auditory cortex are also involved in lip reading in deaf individuals and seem to have a more important role in visual language processing in the brain of deaf people than in the brain of hearing people. However, signers didn't show any additional changes in brain activity when looking at images without language contact, showing that knowing sign language doesn't result in any additional changes or differences in brain function. We think that our findings are important because some cochlear implantation programs recommend against the use of visual languages such as sign language or even speech reading before implantation. And they do this by claiming that plasticity in auditory regions, so plasticity here, we talk about this change from processing sounds to processing images or touch. They claim that these are driven by sign language knowledge or could be increased by sign language knowledge, and that sign language use could interfere with speech acquisition. But we know that plasticity is not bad for language development in deaf children with and without cochlear implants, and that knowing a sign language does not affect the plasticity in the auditory cortex. Thank you very much for your interest in this research. I hope you find it useful.